I thought Sarah was my sister in every way that mattered, until the morning I found a torn FedEx envelope on my doorstep, empty except for a ripped label that once read urgent. That job offer letter had been my ticket to a $220K position. I didn't lose it. Someone took it. Days later, I saw her, my sister-in-law, on my doorbell camera, slipping the letter into her purse. I could have confronted her. I didn't. Instead, I smiled, saved the video, and decided the perfect moment to expose her would be the one day she thought she owned the room, her wedding day. For months after marrying Daniel, I told myself I was lucky. His family had welcomed me with open arms, or so it seemed. Sunday dinners were filled with warm laughter, the clinking of wine glasses, and Sarah, my sister-in-law, looping her arm through mine in photos she would later post on Instagram with captions like, "Sisters by law and by heart." People would comment on how close we looked. I believed it. I wanted to believe it. But sometimes, the smallest things plant the deepest seeds of doubt. I noticed how Sarah's smile would falter when I talked about my career. She would change the subject, steer the conversation toward her own work, her own successes. Still, I brushed it off as coincidence, or maybe a quirk in her personality. One Saturday morning, I stepped outside to pick up a package I'd been expecting. A FedEx envelope I knew held the offer letter for a job I'd been chasing for months. The sight of it stopped me cold. The flap was ripped open, the label urgent torn nearly in half. Inside, nothing but air. My heartbeat stuttered. I turned the envelope over as if the letter might be clinging to its walls, hiding from me. But it was gone. Completely gone. I stood there on the porch, the cool air biting at my skin, trying to piece together a reasonable explanation. Maybe the delivery guy made a mistake. Maybe the letter had fallen out. Maybe... The front door opened. Sarah's voice was like honey over ice. "Oh, did something exciting come?" She glanced at the empty envelope in my hands, her lips curving into a polite, practiced smile. I couldn't tell if the flicker in her eyes was curiosity or satisfaction. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the morning in my mind, the torn label, the hollow envelope, Sarah's voice. By the third replay, my pulse had steadied into something darker, suspicion. The next day, I pulled up the footage from our doorbell camera. The video loaded slowly, as if it knew it held something I wasn't ready to see. And there she was, Sarah in her tailored coat and perfect hair, walking up the driveway. She paused at the mailbox, reached in, and pulled out the FedEx envelope. She looked around, slipped it into her purse, and walked away. I watched it 3 times, hoping to catch some sign of hesitation, some hint that this was a misunderstanding. There was none. Just a clean, deliberate act. My first instinct was to storm over to her house, slam the video down on her kitchen counter, and demand an explanation. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized she had given me something far more valuable than a job offer. She had given me proof. And proof, in the right hands, is power. Later that week, I did some digging. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. 6 months ago, Sarah had interviewed at the same company. She'd made it to the final round, but hadn't gotten the job. I found a post she'd made on Facebook back then, a subtle lament about opportunities slipping away because of favoritism. I wondered how she'd feel knowing the person who'd taken her opportunity was her new sister-in-law. Scrolling further, I found something else, a private family group chat. I hadn't been invited to it, of course, but screenshots have a way of slipping through the cracks. In the chat, Sarah was the loudest voice. Her username, Sun Queen, was plastered, beside comments mocking my career. Still living off Danny's paycheck, I see. Let's hope she learns to cook before she tries to get a job. The anger that rose in me was clean and sharp, but I didn't let it spill. Instead, I thought about timing. Revenge, I knew, was not about the loudest shout, but the most strategic strike. And the most strategic strike would be at the moment when she believed she was untouchable. I saved the doorbell video in 3 different places: my phone, my laptop, and the cloud. Then I crafted a message to Sarah. Just one line. No accusations, no anger. "I'll see you at your big day." I could almost hear her scoff when she read it. Could imagine her tossing her phone aside, certain I'd given up the fight. She wouldn't know until it was too late that the fight hadn't even started yet. I spent the next few weeks perfecting an act that even I almost believed. Whenever the topic of work came up at family dinners, I'd sigh, shrug, and say, "Still no luck. I've sent out dozens of applications, but it's brutal out there." I let my voice trail off just enough to invite pity. Sarah would smirk into her wine glass, probably convinced her little stunt had worked. Behind the scenes, the truth was a different story. 2 days after finding the doorbell footage, I'd signed the contract for the $220K position. My new employer's HR manager agreed to keep everything confidential until I chose to announce it. The agreement gave me something precious: control over the reveal. One night, while sitting in my home office, I stared at a framed certificate from my old life. Before marrying Daniel, I had been a marketing director, building campaigns that played with perception, guiding an audience toward exactly the reaction I wanted. My career had been about crafting moments that made people talk. Sarah had no idea she'd handed me the perfect material for my next masterpiece. Then one evening, as I was about to shut down my laptop, a notification popped up from an unknown number. "If you want justice, wait for the vows." I read it twice, my pulse ticking up. The sender didn't identify themselves, but the message was clear. Someone inside Sarah's world wanted to help me. I started looking for an ally and didn't have to search long. During a family brunch, I found myself next to Emily, one of Sarah's younger cousins. Emily had the same sharp eyes and dry humor as her mother, but there was a subtle frost in the way she spoke about Sarah. Over coffee, I dropped a hint about wanting to capture every moment of the wedding. Emily grinned. "You mean the kind of moments people don't forget?" Within a week, Emily had agreed to film everything from her seat. Not the polite, sweeping shots of the bride and groom, but close, unfiltered clips. We both knew what we were aiming for: evidence. Then came the next piece of intel. Through Emily, I learned Sarah had hired an MC who was not only a family acquaintance, but also willing to slip in a lighthearted jab about me during the reception speech. Sarah wanted the crowd laughing at my expense before the cake was even cut. I didn't get angry. I got busy. I drafted my own speech, a counter script that could pivot from their joke into my announcement. I rehearsed the timing, imagining the shift in the room, the way laughter would freeze into silence, then erupt into something else entirely. A week before the wedding, I stopped by the venue under the guise of helping with decorations. While Sarah fussed over table placements, I wandered to the stage. The microphone was sleek, heavier than I expected. Out of curiosity, I tapped it lightly. My voice echoed through the hall, and then a second later, through my phone. I froze, then glanced at a camera operator by the far wall. "Testing the live stream," he said casually. Live stream. The word hit me like a match to dry paper. This wasn't just going to be a room full of guests. Whatever happened on that stage would be broadcast to anyone tuning in online, family across the country, friends, maybe even strangers if the link got shared. The stakes had just tripled. I imagined Sarah's face, the moment the video of her stealing my letter lit up screens, not just in the hall, but in living rooms miles away. I imagined the hashtags, the rewinds, the freeze frames, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to feel something dangerously close to excitement. I set the mic back in its stand and smiled at the thought. Sarah had planned to humiliate me in front of 100 people. I was going to answer in front of thousands. The week of the wedding, I made myself indispensable. I went with Sarah to the florist, feigning fascination over peonies versus garden roses. I knelt at the hem of her dress, smoothing fabric and pretending I couldn't imagine anything more important than making her shine. I laughed when she teased me about my new career as a stylist. She didn't know every compliment I gave was another brick in the wall I was building around her blind spot. Emily later sent me an audio file she'd recorded in Sarah's kitchen. Sarah's voice was dripping with satisfaction. Hannah will keep her mouth shut, she told her best friend. She's too embarrassed to say anything. Honestly, I think she's accepted her place. Hearing it was oddly gratifying, not because it was true, but because it meant my act was working. On the morning of the rehearsal dinner, I clasped the silver bracelet Daniel had given me for our anniversary. Inside the hollow curve nestled in the clasp was a pinhole camera. It wasn't high-end, but it would catch expressions, gestures, anything I needed from up close. I twisted it into place, the tiny light blinking once before going dark. That night, I stood beside Sarah during the seating run-through, smiling for the benefit of the bridal party while my bracelet's lens quietly recorded. The weight of the plan in motion was almost intoxicating. 2 days before the wedding, a message appeared in my Instagram DMs from someone I didn't recognize. "Sarah's planning a speech about you. No greeting, no explanation, just the warning." I stared at it, weighing whether this was a bluff meant to rattle me or a genuine heads up. The next day, while helping set up at the venue, I finally met the MC. He was leaning against the stage, reviewing his notes. It took me a moment to place him, Jason Miller, from my university days. We'd shared a communications seminar, once pulled an all-nighter co-writing a mock political campaign for class. He'd been quick-witted then. Now his smile told me he hadn't lost it. When I asked him about the speech, he hesitated just long enough to confirm my suspicion. "Yeah, Sarah mentioned a little joke. I didn't love it." He looked at me, measuring something in my expression. "Do you want me to flip it?" The air between us shifted. I told him exactly what I needed, a smooth setup that would hand me the microphone before Sarah could make her jab. He agreed, his voice low. "Let's make it memorable." The day arrived. The reception hall glowed under strings of white lights. Glasses clinked, the scent of champagne and roses hanging heavy in the air. I moved through the crowd with my bracelet camera humming silently. From across the room, I saw Sarah chatting with a cluster of guests, her laughter slicing through the music. When her eyes met mine, they held a certain smugness. She believed the stage was hers, and I was just a prop in the audience. Dinner gave way to speeches. Jason took the stage, his voice steady, warm, setting the mood. He glanced at Sarah, then back at the crowd. But before we continue, there's someone here who deserves a very special introduction. Someone whose presence today is significant. Sarah's brows knitted in confusion. Jason extended a hand toward me. "Hannah, would you join us?" I rose from my seat, every movement deliberate. My pulse was steady, my smile fixed. Around me, conversations hushed, attention narrowing to the narrow space between my chair and the microphone. Sarah stood just behind Jason, ready to take her place at center stage, until I stepped past her, the spotlight catching on the silver at my wrist. I wrapped my fingers around the mic. The night was about to turn. The microphone was warm in my hand, the weight of 100 eyes, and countless more through the live stream, settling on me. I started softly, my voice pitched to carry just enough warmth to melt suspicion. "First, I want to say how grateful I am to be here today," I said, glancing at Sarah with a smile that could have passed for sisterly affection. "Sarah, you look beautiful, and I truly wish you and Mark a lifetime of happiness." A murmur of polite approval drifted through the crowd. Sarah's shoulders relaxed. She thought this was a tribute. I let a beat of silence stretch, just long enough for everyone to think the speech was over. Then I leaned forward, my tone shifting, drawing them in. You know, weddings are about love, trust, and family. But sometimes, family can surprise you. I paused, scanning the room. Let me tell you a little story about a letter. Some guests chuckled, thinking it was a harmless anecdote. I continued, each word measured. This letter was important, life-changing in fact. It was an offer for a dream job, but it never reached the person it was meant for. Someone else decided to keep it. A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. I glanced at the MC. Jason nodded almost imperceptibly, and the giant LED screen behind us flickered to life. There it was, the grainy but unmistakable footage from my doorbell camera. Sarah in her tailored coat, looking over her shoulder before slipping the FedEx envelope into her purse. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to pull the air from the hall. Sarah's face drained of color. "Turn that off," she snapped, but the video looped, zooming in on the decisive moment. "Some people might think this is just a misunderstanding," I said evenly, but that letter contained my offer for a $220,000 position, and while someone tried to take that from me, I turned back to Sarah, meeting her eyes. I'm happy to say they failed. Jason stepped up to the mic. "I can personally confirm the authenticity of this footage," he told the stunned audience. The murmurs swelled again, shifting toward outrage. I let the moment hang before delivering the final line. "Luckily, I start my $220,000 position next Monday." My smile was calm, almost gentle, but the effect was anything but. The room erupted. Some clapping, some whispering, all watching Sarah. She took a step forward, her face contorted. "You manipulative little," she began, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The mic caught every syllable, broadcasting it to the hall and the live stream. Gasps replaced applause. She kept going, a tangle of insults spilling out, each more unfiltered than the last. From the corner of my eye, I saw guests pulling out their phones, recording, sending clips. Emily's camera was steady, capturing it all. The screen behind us still held the frozen image of Sarah at the mailbox, her hand clutching the envelope. Mark, the groom, tried to guide her away, but she yanked her arm free, pointing at me. "You're pathetic. You ruined my wedding." I stepped back, letting her words echo. There was nothing more for me to say. The damage was self-inflicted now. By the time Jason ushered me off stage, the air in the hall was electric. Conversations buzzed like static. I caught fragments, doorbell footage, stole her job offer, $220K, floating like embers in the crowd. An hour later, your wedding gate was trending. Clips of Sarah's outburst had already made it to Twitter and TikTok. The LED footage of her stealing the letter played on loop in countless posts, captioned with everything from karma at the altar to never mess with the quiet ones. I slipped away from the main room for a moment into a side hallway. My phone buzzed in my clutch. An email notification lit the screen from my new employer. "Hannah," it began. "Congratulations on what might be the most memorable public debut we've ever seen. We look forward to having you on board." I read it twice, the satisfaction settling deep. This wasn't just about exposing Sarah anymore. It was about reclaiming the narrative entirely. Back in the hall, Sarah had disappeared, leaving Mark to make strained small talk with guests. The reception carried on in a strange, fractured way, people eating and drinking, but with the undercurrent of a story too fresh to ignore. Every so often someone would catch my eye, give a small nod or a barely concealed grin. I knew the night would follow Sarah long after the flowers wilted and the cake was gone. And I knew my story was no longer just mine. It was already being told, retold, and amplified. In that moment, I didn't just feel victorious, I felt untouchable. The morning after the wedding, my phone was a war zone. Notifications poured in faster than I could swipe them away. Hashtags had divided the internet into two camps: Jenny, justice for Hannah, and Isti ruined, the wedding. On one side, strangers praised my composure, calling it the ultimate power move. On the other, critics accused me of destroying a family celebration for personal revenge. I tried not to read the comments, but curiosity has a way of slipping past resolve. Some were vicious, calling me cold, selfish, vindictive. Others were fiercely protective, reminding me I'd only exposed the truth. The split was dizzying, and it began to sink in. My victory had gone public, and so had the cost. By mid-afternoon, Sarah had taken to TikTok. Her video began with trembling lips and teary eyes, the camera angled to catch the light just so. She claimed she had been misunderstood, that the envelope incident was a joke gone wrong, that she never meant to hurt family. The comments section swelled with sympathy from her followers, people who didn't know or didn't care about the footage. I sat on the couch, watching her performance, a strange hollowness settling in my chest. She was good, too good. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed her myself. That evening, Daniel came home looking drained. He tossed his keys onto the counter, glanced at me, then at the muted television replaying the wedding clip. "Your mother's not well," he said quietly. It took me a second to process. "What do you mean?" "She's been having trouble sleeping since the wedding. Dad says her blood pressure's through the roof. The stress. It's not good for her." I felt my stomach tighten. I hadn't meant for my mother-in-law to get caught in the crossfire, but the truth was, there was no way to separate her from it. Families don't work like that. Later that night, Daniel stood in the doorway to our bedroom, his arms crossed. Was it worth it? The question hung between us, heavy and sharp. I wanted to say yes, to defend every choice I'd made, but the words caught in my throat. The days that followed blurred into a mix of interviews, phone calls, and social media noise. Friends texted congratulations, while distant acquaintances messaged just to say they'd seen me on Twitter. I smiled, thanked them, played the part of the woman in control, but underneath, something shifted. It started with a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Daniel was on the phone in his office, the door half closed. I'd gone in to grab my laptop charger when his voice stopped me cold. "Yeah, I knew about it," he was saying. "Saw the envelope in her bag a couple of days after it happened. I didn't tell Hannah, figured it wasn't my fight." A pause, then a chuckle. "Besides, I wanted to see how it played out." I stood frozen in the hallway, my fingers numb around the charger cable. It wasn't my fight. Wanted to see how it played out. The phrases looped in my mind, each repetition heavier than the last. When he hung up, I walked into the room. "You knew?" He blinked, surprised but not guilty. "Knew what?" "About Sarah. About the letter." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Hannah, you were going to find out sooner or later. I thought maybe it would, motivate you." "Motivate me?" My voice cracked, a tremor of disbelief undercutting the anger. He shrugged. "You handled it. You won. What's the problem?" The problem was that the man I'd built my life with had seen me sabotaged and had chosen to watch, not warn. That he'd treated my betrayal as entertainment. That his loyalty was conditional on his amusement. I left his office without another word, the air between us colder than it had ever been. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling, listening to his breathing. The room was dark, but the realization was blinding. The most dangerous betrayal wasn't the one that had been played out under wedding lights. It was the one sleeping inches from me, disguised as partnership. The morning I left, the house was still. Daniel was asleep in the bedroom, oblivious to the quiet dismantling of our life. I moved through the rooms with deliberate calm, sliding clothes into suitcases, stacking boxes by the door. Every creak of the floorboards felt final. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to explain. He'd made his choices, and I had made mine. By noon, I was unlocking the door to a sunlit apartment on the 10th floor of a building across town. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibility. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, framing the city in all its chaotic beauty. For the first time in months, I felt the knots in my chest begin to loosen. The next day, I started my new job. Walking into the office, I was met with nods, handshakes, and genuine welcomes. My workspace overlooked a park, the trees beginning to bud with early spring leaves. Every keystroke, every meeting was a reminder that I'd earned this, not just the position, but the right to stand in it without apology. Sarah called twice that week. Daniel texted once. "We should talk." I didn't answer. My silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. The absence of my voice was its own boundary. One evening, as I was unpacking books in my living room, my laptop pinged with a new email. The subject line read, "Publishing Inquiry." Curious, I opened it. "Ms. Clark," it began, I'm a literary agent representing a publishing house interested in stories of resilience and justice. We've seen coverage of your recent experience and believe your story could inspire many. Would you consider collaborating on a memoir?" I leaned back, letting the words settle. A book. My story in my own voice without edits from people who wanted to spin it for their own ends. It was tempting. Not for revenge, but for reclamation. By the following week, I'd said yes. The writing process was cathartic. For hours each night, I poured the past year onto the page, every moment of doubt, every betrayal, every calculated choice. I didn't paint myself as flawless. I wrote about my mistakes, my hesitations, the nights I lay awake wondering if I'd gone too far. But I also wrote about the clarity that comes when you stop asking for permission to defend yourself. It was through that writing that the idea for something bigger began to take shape. A community, not just a story. Within a month, I launched the Rebuild Network, a private online group for women who'd faced professional sabotage from those closest to them. The membership grew faster than I expected. Emails from across the country, stories as raw and tangled as my own. Some were heartbreaking, others infuriating, all threaded with the same quiet determination to reclaim what had been stolen. The group became more than a space to share grievances. It became a workshop for solutions. We held virtual meetups, strategy sessions, and even mock interviews to help members step back into the workforce stronger than before. To reach a wider audience, I started a podcast. At first, it was just me, a microphone, and a desk lamp in my apartment. I spoke about boundaries, about reading between the lines of people's intentions, about refusing to let betrayal define the rest of your life. Guests began to reach out. Career coaches, therapists, women who'd fought their way back from similar blows. By the third month, the podcast was charting in the top 10 on Spotify's Society and Culture list. The messages I received shifted from sympathy to gratitude. "You made me quit apologizing for being ambitious. You reminded me I'm not crazy for expecting loyalty. You made me believe in starting over." One Friday morning, I stood by my apartment window, coffee in hand, watching the city stir awake. Cars wove through intersections. People hurried along sidewalks, the sky turning a soft gold over the skyline. It struck me that the view felt nothing like the one I'd had in my old life. Back then, my windows had faced inward, into rooms where I was always second-guessing my worth, into a family that had seen my ambition as a threat to be managed. Now the view opened outward to streets I hadn't yet walked, to opportunities I hadn't yet named. I smiled, not the sharp, triumphant smile of someone who'd just won a battle, but the quiet, steady one of someone who no longer needed to fight to exist on her own terms. The wedding, the scandal, the hashtags, they were chapters I'd closed. What remained was mine to build, brick by brick, choice by choice. And for the first time, I wasn't looking back.